Okay, so welcome to this last lecture. In the meantime, I went to Dijon to a most peculiar conference. I should have spent more time preparing this lecture instead, but that was an interesting experience. Anyway, today we will be talking about extended uses of temperature terms. Just to remind you, last time I introduced the different angles that can be approached while talking about the linguistics of temperature, and we spent some time talking about how languages conceptualize the temperature domain, what temperature concepts are encoded as words across languages, and we talked also a lot about lexical grammar interaction, mainly on the basis of the Slavic languages, but not only those languages. So today we will be talking about the third angle when we are talking about from expressions to meaning, or the semasiological aspects of lexical typological research. And here we will be mainly talking about what are the possible extensions of temperature terms to other domains. I don't think we will have time for the other angle of this or the other dimension, from where do the temperature terms come. Okay, so in our familiar languages, well, you guys know many languages, so what's familiar to you is less familiar to other people. Well, in our familiar languages, temperature concepts are often used for talking about emotions and human predispositions, hot temperaments, warm feelings, for referring to other perceptual modalities like hot spices, warm colors, and for many other things. So which of these recur across languages of the world and why? Are there any universal connections? Well, what's universal is complicated and things are not so straightforward. So for instance, physiologically, there's a connection between temperature perception and perception of spicy food. So it has been shown that the same nociceptor, these are sensory neurons involved in the detection of pain-producing stimuli, is activated by painful heat and by chili peppers. So the guys who made this discovery, they got a Nobel Prize a few years ago. So there's this connection. And then you would think that, okay, if there is this universal physiological connection, there will be a cross-model recurrent expressions like hot kettle and hot pepper. But this turns out not to be correct at all. So even in the familiar languages, languages differ as to whether they can use hot for cross-model perception or not. So in Russian, peppers are sharp. In Swedish, they are strong. What about French? You have piquant?
Same as Swedish.
Yes, yes. So they're sharp. Piquant? No?
Like in Swedish.
Mm-hmm. 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 All right. So, and even worse, not all languages can use temperature terms for other domains at all, something that we'll be talking about. So the main part, I guess, of this lecture will be on the connection between affection and warmth, or warmth or affection. So on hearing that someone is warm, you will understand that we're talking about a friendly person, someone who shows affection and enthusiasm and is in generally very nice. So why warm? Is it a pure chance that we use the same adjective warm for describing people and for describing concrete temperatures, like in warm water or it's warm here? Or is there a deep connection between these uses and experiences underlying them? And there has been a lot of interesting research about these issues. So these questions have attracted considerable attention from both psychologists and linguists. So again, I think people got some, not Nobel Prize, but some kind of big prizes. For social psychology, there were very famous experiments by Williams and Bog, where participants, they were Americans, I think in New York, people were going by the elevator in this skyscraper, and they met people when they arrived there, and they had to judge whether these people were friendly, unfriendly, and doing other things. And the participants in these experiments were randomly given warm or cold objects to hold while they were traveling by the elevator. So they were like, oh, can you please, the experiment leader asked them, oh, can you please help me while I am doing something else? And then it turned out that those people who had been given warm cups or cups of warm coffee, they were more positively disposed when they met these new people. So they judged them as more friendly, as more hospitable, and so on and so forth. So the experiments showed, the interpretation was that there is this very deep connection between concrete warmth and how you appreciate other people. And since then, between 2008 and 2018, I have old data, there are more than 80 published and unpublished reports on the relation between what has been called social thermoregulation and various other domains. So thermoregulation, interpersonal relationships, is crucially linked or even organized by processes of body temperature regulation. For instance, there's research by Fetterman et al., where people had to make daily reports on how they feel towards other people, and depending on the weather. So they had to say that, well, today I was a little bit angry, or today I felt like I liked everyone and whatever. And so people felt more caring towards others and viewed themselves as more agreeable on days that they felt physically warmer. There's a lot of other research saying that diversity in social networks helps to protect core body temperature against the cold. Coldness makes people think about loved ones, so when it's cold, people go and see romantic comedies more often. So lots and lots and all this. And for people who are interested, I can recommend this charming book by my friend and colleague with whom I started doing this, Hans Eiserman, How Our Inner Thermostat Made Us Human. So it's a popular book. It has been translated to all kinds of languages, among other Russian. So I was approached by someone because he quotes me a lot. So I had to give like transcriptions of various exotic languages that I mention in my work. So it's a nice book. Okay. However, as always, the bulk of the relevant research has involved and has been carried out by speakers of major European and often Germanic languages. In most cases English, which uses warm and cold, both in reference to physical temperature and in reference to interpersonal relationships. And in general, this is also very interesting. It's very hard to find any information on the native languages of the experimenters or of the participants and on the language involved in the experiments. That's like something that they don't care about. You know, everything, if you have it in English, then you have it in all the other languages. The language doesn't matter. So the tacit assumption is that words like warm and cold in both uses are self-evident and easily translatable among languages or between languages. So this was social psychology. Now, in cognitive linguistics, one of the most famous universal cognitive metaphors is affection is warmth. So it has been mentioned and described in various works by Lakoff and Johnson, also in the groundbreaking book Metaphors We Live By, Kövecses, Grady. So, and Grady has this distinction between primary and non-primary metaphors. So primary metaphors originate in recurring correlations in experience that lead to natural cognitive associations between them. So these are primary. They are very often connected to the bodily, very elementary bodily sensations, and that's how we build up this connections, associations between various things. So difficulty is heaviness or difficulty is hardness are among these primary metaphors. It's a very concrete thing. So when something is heavy, it's difficult to carry this. Or when you have to, I don't know, cut something and it's very hard, again, it's very difficult. So affection is warmth is one of those primary metaphors. Kövecses writes, we metaphorically view affection as warmth because of the correlation in our childhood experiences between the loving embrace of our parents and the comforting bodily warmth that accompanies it. This gives us the conceptual metaphor, affection is warmth. So here we go. This is my son with his baby. You know, he carries her, so the baby feels the warmth of the body and feels that her dad cares about her. And this goes back actually to the old literature on attachment and the links between physical contact and attachment formation. Okay, so there is this idea that this is a very universal experience. You carry your babies or you embrace them and they feel that your bodily warmth and also that you care about them. And there's this tacit assumption, it's unclear when exactly this assumption pops up, that primary metaphors are universal because they're grounded in universal bodily experiences. Okay, well, expressions like warm people and warm smiles are not only found in English or German, they are also found in other languages, non-West European languages, so Ukrainian, a warm talk will be, well, a heart-to-heart talk. Palula, an Indo-Aryan language that I think I quoted massively last time, an Indo-Aryan language spoken in Pakistan on the border to Afghanistan. You say heart or warm heart means generous. You have Persian. My father was having a very friendly chat with my friend. I have an example from Cantonese. So feeling warm in heart, and so on. So these examples are not restricted to English or German or Swedish. They seem to pop up here and there. However, even if we have examples like that, it's a long way to say that they are universal. So if an association is taken to be universal on the basis of commonly used English expressions, wouldn't it be expected that it should also find multiple parallels in other languages? So the main question here is, are linguistic manifestations of the affection is warmth association really widely spread across languages of the world? Or are they biased towards particular language families or geographic areas? So this question had not been asked and answered. So what I will be saying now, for the most part, comes from the paper by myself and Dmitry Nikolaev, which was published in the International Review of Social Psychology. So it's a social psychological journal, and a year ago. So this paper, based on a sample of 94 languages coming from all over the world, is the first systematic cross-linguistic study on expressions that can be interpreted as manifestations of the affection as warmth metaphor. So universality, how would we know? Well, people can have different opinions, but for those of us who work with linguistic typology, cross-linguistic comparison, large scale or small scale, we know that we want to compare, we want to have comparable data from hopefully many different languages, preferably belonging to different families and spoken in different parts of the world. And we also want to have a procedure that ensures that we compare like with like. So preferably something, well, theory or framework, neutral definitions, and observable phenomena. When we approach metaphors, this is methodologically very, very difficult, because people who work on metaphors, especially this conceptual metaphor theory like Lakoff and Johnson, they say that metaphors do not boil down to particular instances. Metaphors is something that you have everywhere. So it penetrates the whole language. And this makes sort of really the investigation of to what extent they're universal, systematic, regular, very difficult, because they can also always tell you, oh, you haven't found examples, but you haven't looked at other places in the language. So methodologically, it's very difficult to falsify the metaphors that have been suggested. And even, I always forget how to pronounce him, Gibbs or Gibbs, one of the very prominent cognitive scientists and cognitive linguists. He himself writes that cognitive linguists and others should articulate criteria for identifying metaphoric patterns in language and inferring specific conceptual metaphors from discourse. These procedures should be specified with sufficient detail so that other researchers can possibly replicate the analysis and emerge with similar conclusions. So what we will be doing here is, if we translate this into the methodology of systematic cross-linguistic research, we can't test the whole metaphor because that's too much, but we can test the extent to which some very concrete manifestations of these suggested metaphors hold across languages, rather than whether whole conceptual metaphors are universal. So that's what we will be doing now. We will restrict ourselves to temperature terms, such as hot and warm and cold, and check to what extent these have uses that may be related to affection as warmth metaphor. So we have two basic questions here. What uses are meant here, and what is meant by temperature terms, such as hot, warm, cold, something we talked about last time. So typical context for affection as warmth. So affection is about caring about someone. That's it. So it's a directed emotion or whatever disposition. It's not only I feel very good, but it's you feel that there's some kind of a relation to other people. So when people talk about affectionate context or affection as warmth expressions, we have various contexts, people and emotional attitudes. So people who show friendly emotions are warm, not showing are cold. So we can talk about warm people, we can talk about bodily entities that are metonymically related to emotions, heart, face, eyes, manifestations of emotions like look, smile, voice. We can talk about interpersonal relations and social interaction, like warm cooperation, warm collaboration, so relations between peoples, institutions. We can talk about social interaction, particularly in communication, so warm reception, warm words, speech, general mood or feeling, like the warm atmosphere, or a group of people related by friendly relations. We can also talk about intrinsically positive emotions, some like affection, friendship, love, happiness, and joy. So these are the contexts where we find these warm as affection as warm expressions. And again, so this is what context are we looking at, what kinds of expressions, and then, what kind of meanings, uses. And the other is what is meant by warm words. And I would remind you what I said last time. So even simple words like warm and hot and cold in English are far from being self-evident and easily translatable to other languages. So warm for pleasantly comfortable warming temperatures is not necessarily distinguished by a special word in languages, and languages can have different expressions for different kinds of temperature evaluation, what we talked about last time. So il fait chaud, j'ai chaud, il est chaud. So tactile temperature sensation and thermoregulation. And to remind you again what I showed last time, so you can have different systems. We talked about that last. Now I switched to Swedish also, all of a sudden. Last time, so languages can have more or less elaborated systems of their temperature terms. So the languages that just have this opposition between cold and cool and warm and hot, you can have more dedicated, more elaborate things, and I even, yes, so the two-value system, as I said last time, so the opposition between cold and cool and warm and hot is the most common one. Then we can have three-value systems, so Finnish, cold, warm, and hot. We can have four-value system, cold, cool, warm, and hot, and even one-value system.
Five. Dutch has five.
Dutch has five, but it's not very. I mean, you missed my last lecture, so you should keep silent. I can talk to you separately. Yes, I mean that's a very interesting. Yes. So what? Yes. So how do you talk about these main values? So we are talking about main values. That is distinctions that are sort of everywhere in the system and not restricted to one particular kind of evaluation. Frame of evaluation of particular entities, but we can have a private conversation on this. Yes. And I also showed you last time that even languages that have warm and hot, the difference can be in different places. So we said that for Russian, warm is very restricted. It's very pleasant. It's very restricted. Hot is not necessarily very unpleasant. It can go to unpleasant, but in other languages, the difference can be like warm is a lot of warming things and hot starts exactly when you feel that it's dangerous and unpleasant. So languages vary quite a lot. And then we just say that we test to what extent any frequent words that are systematically used for warming, any warming temperatures can have affectionate uses. So how widely are affectionate warm expressions spread across languages of the world? Is their distribution influenced by areal and or genetic affiliation of languages? Is there a connection between the presence of affectionate warm expressions in a language and the existence of the opposition between warm and hot in the same language? And finally, is there any connection between the presence of affectionate warm expressions in a language and the climatic conditions under which the language is spoken? So these will be the leading questions. And our data sources, massive and very different. So we have these descriptions of 25 languages in this volume that I edited, various descriptions of particular languages. I have these very extensive temperature guidelines. They were filled in by experts, queries to experts posted at LinkTube, dictionary and corpus searches. So you take whatever you find. And I have several papers here that are devoted to temperature metaphors. So this is Persian, conceptualization of temperature in Persian. This is on Italian, Serena Coschignano. And this is Yvonne on Kambata, which is, you should read it. This is one of my favorite papers. Yes, and then we had all these chapters in the book. So our sample, 94 languages from 24 language families, as well as 4 isolates, 2 Creole languages, and 1 artificial language, Esperanto. And then it's genetically and areally totally uneven. 30 Indo-European languages, 13 Niger-Congo languages, only 6 Austronesian, 6 Uralic, and you get it. But, I mean, for this kind of research, this is already very, very much. So here's the sample at a glance. And so when we have collected, Dmitri's contribution was mainly statistical, so I collected all these things due to my, thanks to all my friends and slaves and I don't know what. So, then we had to classify these languages, and we had 3 parameters. So whether they have, so one parameter is where the languages have linguistic expressions in which words for warming temperatures are used to refer to experiences that can be connected to interpersonal warmth, affection, communal sharing. So this is the main question. So the main parameter, whether languages have expressions from warmth to affection. Then whether these languages make a consistent distinction between terms for pleasantly, comfortably warming and unpleasantly, uncomfortably, dangerously warming, warm and hot. And finally, whether languages do have any extended metaphorical uses of their temperature terms at all. So not necessarily for these things, but if they do have temperature uses, extended uses at all. So we have these coding categories. Took a while to come up with them. So for warm and warm affection, well, some things are very easy. We don't have any attested examples. So the experts tell us, well, I've tried very hard, but I haven't found any. Then we have multiple examples, systematic connection, also with code. So for English and Russian, you will have lots and lots and lots of examples. We have warm and cold, and you will have lukewarm and things like that in between. Then we have isolated examples. These two last categories are difficult. It took us a while to come up with them. Isolated examples, most probably calques. I will give you a couple examples. And then transparent derivation or historical connection. As far as I understand, chaud in modern French is hardly used for talking about people and smiles. But you have chaleureux, which is clearly the same, well, derived from that. And it was used for ambient warm until the 15th century. So there's this historical connection, and it would have been very bad just to throw this away, because you see this connection, but it's not synchronized. So we had this category, and we don't have so many languages there, but anyway. And it's interesting with the Romance languages, by the way, because they have, yes, for Italian it's still well, not a very productive, but still it's a live metaphor. But so it's different for different Romance languages. Then the next one is where the languages make this distinction between warm and hot. And we were very generous there. So again, 0, no systematic distinction, 1, systematic distinction. And finally, where languages do have any extended uses of temperature terms at all. So it can be hot pepper or cold rage or hot news or whatever in English. And again, no examples, multiple examples, and isolated examples, most probably calques. So what did we do? Well, in our sample, we found 46 languages with affectionate warm expressions, basically restricted to Eurasia, with Europe being particularly rich in languages with such expressions. In our sample, the only language with affectionate warm expressions in Africa is Afrikaans. Big surprise. Then it turned out that we were wrong, because Martin immediately produced a counterexample. You are welcome to go with more counterexamples. But in Belgium, so the word for warm can be used about welcoming generous. So there's this connection. So if you can find more examples in African languages, you are more than welcome. Okay. Then if we look at the families themselves, we have 8 language families and 1 artificial language with such expressions, with the isolated Basque having some occasional examples, basically the calques from Spanish. And the lion's share come from Indo-European. So 16 language families, 3 language isolates, and 2 Creole languages like them. And the only Afro-Asiatic language that has such examples is, guess? Hebrew. Yes, because Hebrew semantically is very much patterned on the European languages, basically Slavic and Germanic. So that's quite interesting. I really like this thing with Creole languages, because one is Bislama and the other is Tokpisin. So they are based on European languages that do have these things, but still they don't have this. So they semantically they don't pattern with what you have in Europe, in Eurasia, but they. Yes, sure. Yeah, that's the thing. So it's the local. So they, even if they use whatever it can be, hot and show, whatever. So the semantic patterns is the local one and not the European one. Why I had Esperanto? People always ask me, why do you have Esperanto? Well, it's an accident, and that's also an accident that evokes my interest for antonyms, because I had this student who wanted to, who was passionate about Esperanto, and he wrote a bachelor work on the temperature terms in Esperanto. And we discovered all kinds of interesting things. So, well, I told you that the Esperanto cold and hot, Rael, help me. Is it cold that is mal varmo, or is it mal caldo, or is it mal varmo? Yes. Varmo, mal varmo. So that's this opposition where you have, and also that it had lots of metaphors that were, well, warm metaphors that were calqued on the European language, which is very interesting because, I mean, the structure had been created systematically, but the metaphors came when people started using this. All right. So if you look at the distribution of these affectionate warm expressions in our data, you will see that the Indo-European languages are the lion's share of these expressions. So to summarize this, the use of warm for affection is mainly found in the Eurasian languages and primarily in the languages of Europe. So Indo-European, the hotbed is Slavic, Baltic, and Germanic, massively. Italic Romance, to a certain degree, Greek, Indo-Iranian, Armenian. Uralic, you have massive, it's a typo here, Finnish, Estonian, to occasional users, probably borrowed from Russian. Then you have Turkic, Mongolic to a certain degree, Afro-Asiatic only in Hebrew, Japanese, Sino-Tibetan, the examples why we have a Chinese Cantonese, Austronesian, Indonesian. So that's it. And if you look at the map, I don't know if you can see it, unfortunately. So the distribution of affection as warmth languages. So you have a warmth as affection. What you are interested in is yellow things. Now you probably can't see it. And then there are different versions of this. So they're massively concentrated to Europe, with some places in Eurasia. And then there's another map showing, again, you probably can't see it, but the distribution of languages having or lacking extended uses of their temperature terms. And this is very different. So you have many, many languages, like in Africa. You have lots of languages that have extended uses of temperature terms, but not to affectionate warmth. You have here, in those languages, you have, so this leads us to the question that Alex asked last time, which I will pick up. So languages can have extended uses of temperature terms, but not related to this affection warmth. So I'll give you a few examples of the languages that lack extended uses of temperature terms at all. And they are different, come from different places. So Jahai, Austroasiatic, Asli, spoken in Malaysia, Tamil. Well, when it comes to Jahai, my data are better. Tamil, it was like an anonymous informant. Kelderari, Kelderashomani, Kirill Kazanov. Ainu, Piraha. Piraha lacks everything, so it's not a surprise. Apa Kuskokwim, which is in Dene Athabascan language. Hoop, from Amazonia, and Apa Napo Quechua, a Quechua language. So these are in this sample. You see quite a few languages from different parts of the world. And then you have, this is a very interesting group, so languages which have isolated affectionate warmth expressions, just isolated, but lacking any other extended uses of their temperature terms. So the languages here are Nganasan, Hanti, Nganasan, Komipermiak, so the 3 Uralic languages, and Eastern Ojibwe. So all of them pretty endangered languages, moribund languages, under heavy pressure of the dominant languages. So here you have interesting examples from hunting. So you have a warm person, and Ganasan is, but in which languages are you working with? When the
Hilmari.
Ah?
Hilmari.
Sami? No.
Hilmari.
Aha, okay. Sorry, Hilmari. Okay, so Hilmari is a little bit less endangered, I guess, or?
I guess so, yeah.
Yes. Ganasan is the northernmost language in Eurasia, and it's heavily, heavily endangered. There are not so many people talking that. And this is an interesting example. Thank you for your warm words. So in my colleagues who worked on this language, who wrote, who has this chapter, they said that this is the only example in their corpus, and thank you for your warm words, and thank you is a borrowing from Russian. So spasibo. So you see, it's here. It's even a mixture. I mean, it's strengthens this idea that it's a borrowing. It's also like, a formula. Komi Kermak have all these warm greetings, cold eyes. A couple of examples again based on Russian. And when it comes to Eastern Ojibwe, an Algonquin language, my colleagues found these examples like warm life. She's a kind, human, hospitable, generous, leads a warm life, and she's a cold-hearted. And this was the only thing they found. Again, they don't know if it's a rest left over from something that was more widespread, or whether it has been used. I don't know. So, but these are just fossilized, very isolated examples. You can't say that, okay, they are there, but to what extent they are really show this productive and conceived association between warmth and affection is really debatable. Okay, so there are all kinds of fancy statistical things here that Dmitry worked with. So we can see that what he mixed models and all kinds of things. So Europe is the only region where such languages occur frequently enough. And the connection between affection and warmth in other macro areas is either on the chance level of around 50% or is almost never found. So they can occur at some other places, but it's a pure chance. And then we have this question of, okay, you can say that if a language does not distinguish between warm and hot, so you don't have this dedicated word for pleasantly warm, so perhaps the connection shouldn't be that obvious between this pleasantness and affection. Well, it shows that there is some kind of correlation here. So if languages do have this distinction between warm and hot, the chance that they will have affectionate warm expressions is higher than if they don't have this distinction. But the correlation is not very clear. So most languages of the world will not have this distinction at all. And you can have examples going in both directions. So again, Palula, which does not distinguish between warm and hot, has both metaphors, affection is warmth and anger is heat, depending on which word you combine it with. So if you say he's hot person, that he's an angry person. If you say hot heart, it will be generous. So depending on, and the same goes for Greek, but then you have languages like Mapudungun, Yucatec Maya, Gorene, which have distinction. They distinguish between warm and hot, but they have no affection as warmth expressions. What else do we have? Yes. So, okay, well, I read this with the effects of the macro areas and of the yes. And then we check this thing with the climate, because that's interesting. So it's a very obvious connection, right? So what we did is we added the data on the annual average annual temperatures, or whatever it is. I mean, these kinds of things, easily downloadable, and made all these mixing statistical things. But however, when the effects of the macro areas and of the opposition hot and warm are taken into account, there's no additional effect of the climate. I can't pronounce this. Operational as the standard deviation of average monthly temperatures on the presence of affectionless warmth. There are very few data. I mean, it's difficult to have all these variables. You know, like how do you collect your data on different climatic zones independently of the genetic affiliations on kinds. So it's a very nice hypothesis, but statistically it's difficult to test this. Okay, so to wrap up this, the question was, do the frequently used English expressions like warm, cold people, words, eyes have multiple parallels across languages of the world? And the answer is, there's nothing in their distribution that could be interpreted as pointing to a universal association between warmth and affection. On the contrary, from the linguistic point of view, this association is primarily found in the European languages, complemented by several big official languages with lots of users. And as I think I already mentioned, and you know, Europe has been a large convergence zone on many languages, on many levels, with multiple economic, cultural, linguistic connections. We talk about standard average European languages. We talk about these, I quoted these widespread European idioms that connect all the languages. So there's nothing surprising if there's some kind of metaphor that has caught up in the European language that started somewhere and then just spread. Unfortunately, I don't know anything about the history. I would love someone to work at this more attentively. Ancient Greek did not have this metaphor. Modern Greek has. Latin did not have these uses, or had them to a very little low degree. But modern Romance language, or languages having some of them, they have it to a certain degree. So this should be interesting historical data to look into. And we can also see examples of how this development could have been carried out. So Ngana-san, which I showed you, has a single affectionate warm expression. Warm word was most probably calque from the dominant Russian language. So if you calque a few examples, then it starts living its own life and it can spread further. And also we have opposite phenomena. So Czech and Slovak and Hungarian, in earlier dictionaries you have examples of warm expressions for people and smiles and all that. But nowadays they have been ousted by the association between warmth and homosexuality, which seems to be an areal phenomenon, by the way, probably in the countries that had something to do with the Austrian Habsburg Empire. So in many of those languages, warm person is a gay. So, right, okay. So, so this was cross-linguistic evidence, and again, we only looked at these expressions. There can be other expressions for that can be interpreted as affection and warm. So, what is the further consequences of these four metaphors? And this is very complicated. So there have been lots of experiments showing that these presumably universal cognitive associations are subject to cross-individual variation. There's a growing number of various psychological studies showing that it's not only cognitive metaphors that connect different domains, but they can be other theories of grounded cognition, and also growing number of counterexamples to conceptual metaphor explanations. So we can try, try to come up with various explanations and various consequences of this kind of studies. There are various suggestions these days on how to relate universal bodily associations to cross-linguistic variation in their manifestation. So people suggest that, well, they are cognitive associations, universal cognitive associations, but they can be latent. And then there are linguistic associations, and that's something different. So you can also always find a way out when you have counterexamples, but no one has actually, so with metaphors, there's very, very, very little cross-linguistic systematic research. It's always like 4 or 5 languages, English, Spanish, Japanese, whatever, Chinese, and that's it. So it's really something where we have to talk to each other much more. When I show the data, when we have this data that these examples are very, very much restricted to Eurasian languages, primarily to European languages, the question is how these can be interpreted when it comes to the cognitive association between the two domains. So there are 2 potential reactions. One is just to discount linguistic facts and say, okay, so linguistics is one thing, but cognitive association is something different. Or to take the linguistic facts as seriously as casting doubts on the universality of the suggested association and look for other explanations. So there's some work done that remains to be done. I mean, these experiments with warm cups and people appreciating room and all, so perhaps we can try to do these kinds of experiments in other countries, in other climates, in other cultures, but it's not that easy. All right, and then there are also further consequences that we linguists or typologists, and you of course field workers know very well about, that a lot of evidence is based on familiar European languages. So
there's still a problem with my microphone.
yes. It just gives up regularly. Too much, I can't take it. All right, so I don't know if you are familiar with this term, weird cultures, weird languages. So this was Heinrich et al., a very famous article about meta-analysis of psychological findings. Psychological findings published in international high-profile journals are heavily skewed towards certain samples, usually American undergraduates. So Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, weird. Majid and Levinson say that weird languages have also misled many linguists. We know all that, and have projected assumptions based on English and familiar languages onto the rest. But Dahl came up with another abbreviation. This is LOL languages. So language studies exhibit a particular bias towards LOL languages, literate, official, and with lots of users, which often differ from the other languages. So in this in this study, I showed that these examples were not only restricted to European languages, and definitely not only Western and democratic, but they also occurred in languages like Mongolian, Turkic, Indonesian, Japanese. So this can also be like the manifestation of these are big literate languages with lots of users, official languages. So they might have been influenced by the cultural connections with European languages and so on and so forth. But then we have Chinese, which has these expressions, and this seems to be an old thing. So again, I really hope that some people will look into the prehistory of these expressions. I mean, have a diachrony of, that's for you, of these expressions in Chinese, because there's this so fantastic data, and the same perhaps for Japanese. Okay, so it's not the end. I just want to say that this study has taken very, very, very many years and has not been possible without the active involvement and generous assistance of around 90 language experts and native languages of the sampled, native speakers of the sampled languages. And I'm very grateful to Hans Roche Eisermans, who put me on this, Bode Winter, who commented, another psychologist, Dermot Linot, and my colleagues in Sweden, and former PhD students, Susanne Weidemo and Thomas Herber, who helped with all kinds of things. Okay. Now, so this was warm as affection, but there are possible other universal connections between temperature and emotions. So another metaphor that has been suggested in cognitive linguistics, anger is heat, not known from other places also. So certain emotional responses involve temperature regulation, like anger leads to increased body heat. What about that? Well, if you look, I won't be as detailed with this as I was with warmth as affection, but I can just say that when you look across languages, such expressions are this connection is much more evident cross-linguistically, and hot is primarily associated with various degrees of intensity and danger, ranging from intensive and open manifestations of emotions, eagerness, enthusiasm, passion, sexual desire, anger, violence, or dangerous magic powers. So, and languages differ as to which part of this intensity danger scale is shown by hot in its extended uses. So just to give you a few examples, like angry as being hot in some body part. So we have this Menya, an Angan language from Papua New Guinea. He's angry, well, his abdomen is hot in ancient Egypt, thanks to Gaël Chantrin. Choleric man, angry man, a hot mouth and Kambata, thanks to Yvonne. And he's short-tempered, his nose is warm. He's warm with respect to the nose, or hot. So you have all these kinds of... I also wanted to mention these examples. So to be hot as an attribute of a person having magic powers. So in Sele, it's a Kwa language. Was it Togo Mountain? And one more. Yes, there are three words there, you know. Yes, language spoken in Ghana. Togo Ghana Mountain. Yes, I always forget. In the Volta region in Ghana, where yes, so my PhD students were there. You can have the man has black power, and the man is hot. So he's a magician, and he's a dangerous magician. And you have similar examples in other languages. And also in Kamang, which is an Alor Pantor Timor, again, 3 words, very complicated, described by Antoinette Schepper, who writes, a person with hot blood is one whose blood has special magical properties, which mean that, say, if he's bitten by a snake, then it is the snake that dies and not the bitten person. So I'm poison, my blood is hot, means I'm poison resistant, dangerous for others. And what's even more interesting, she goes on talking about, so it's Kamang and Abui, 2 languages which she described. Normally, hot is associated with negative things and cold with positive things. But there's one exception, blessing, to be blessed, to bless someone, is associated with hot. So it's a charm or a spell bestowed by one person upon another with the intention of bringing happiness or prosperity to the former. So he received my blessing in Kamang will be, well, hot fire, it's a hot, 2 hot things.
Do these languages have a difference between hot and warm?
No, they don't.
Okay, so it could be translated by warm?
No, it's hot. It's hot. Yes, it's hot. My heat or my hotness struck him, and she goes on. So the use of hot for blessing in these 2 languages is very unexpected for 2 reasons. In both languages, hot has primarily negative associations. Also elsewhere in southern Indonesia, it is gold that has positive associations, and blessing builds on gold. So in other languages it's gold, whatever, and this is blessing, but not in these two. So her explanation is that blessing can be associated with supernatural abilities. So if I have hot blood, I have the supernatural abilities, then this blessing could be a continuation of that. A little digression, but I thought it was interesting. Okay, so now let's look at the languages in my sample which have isolated examples of extended uses of their temperature terms, but no affection as warmth expression. So it's not the languages that have a very productive use, but they have isolated. And we have, 3 languages from, or even more from Alex chapter. And then we have Dalabon, an Australian language, Mapudungun, Bardi, in Australian languages, Senson Tepek Chatin, Zapotecan, Ottoman language, and Japhug, Sino-Tibetan. So I just, some of these data come from the chapters in my book, in my edited volume, and some are personal communication with the linguists. So you will see how fantastic they are when you ask questions, and how ready they are to share their data. So Dalabon, I've talked to Nick Evans at some point, and their dictionaries, and then Maya Ponzone, who worked a lot on emotions in this language. And she says that, well, you find anger like heat of the belly in Dalabon, but it's just one expression, and it's not very frequently used. But she has confirmed it, and she says also there's some hesitation because there's a much more common expression for that. You will get really angry, get hot from the belly, but then there's another expression. I won't calm down, my belly won't get released. I'll dwell on my anger, I'll keep talking, thinking in my belly. So Japhug, again, Guillaume Jacques says that extended uses of temperature terms are extremely limited. The only example is with an ideophone for warm, and it's to be angry. This one, Senson Tepek Chatino, the only example Eric Campbell has found is, well, it's a hot blood, meaning bad person, but he says that he is not quite sure. He hasn't checked what bad means. It might mean aggressive and dangerous. And then Mapudungun, again. So Fernando Zuniga writes a lot of things that it's, in Mapudungun, you can have lots of metaphors, and many words that can be used have extended uses. The set of temperature evaluation terms is not one of them. And this contrasts it with Chilean Spanish, who has lots of extended uses. So if caliente, hot, calentar, all these things that can be used for emotions and all that. But for Mapudungun, the only example that has been found is very hot, meaning passionate. And here's the explanation. When uttered by a male speaker, it can have 2 very distinct figurative meanings. It refers to either sexual desire, if the stimulus is a woman, or murderous intentions, if the stimulus is another man. Very logical, right? So what you do in both cases. Well, my consultants disagreed as how to interpret the utterance in the context of a homosexual male speaker or of a female speaker of any sexual orientation. So more research is needed on this topic. And then we have the Manoato languages. Well, it's a lot of quotations here from Alex work. You have several isolated examples, including scorching sensations, but including hot is sometimes associated with anger. So in Bardi, again, an Australian language, hardly any associations. So the only exception is a phrase, lively man, a man who is really a good dancer. Okay. So what we found is that even in those languages that have very, very few examples, in most of them, the only example we have is about anger or dangerous aggressiveness or something. So what about cold then? Well, in the more familiar languages, cold, cool is often linked to the absence of affection towards others. A cold person, and to not being affected by emotions, to keep one's head cold, to rationality, cold reason, and even to cruelty and cold blood. But in many languages, including a number of African languages, cold is primarily associated with peace and calmness in various senses. And this is my endless work in progress. So with Felix Ameka, Ivona Akbetshwa-Meadows, Samuel Atin-Tonton, or a lot of other people from Ghana. We collected lots and lots of data on different languages, but the paper, I have systematized many of them, but the paper has still to be written, and it's not only my fault. But here you have examples. Some of you have seen them. So from Eve, the woman has a cold stomach, or her stomach has become cold, meaning that she's calm, kind. Ear, you have peace. Belly, cold belly in Tafi. She's generous, kind, patient. The next one is my favorite. So his anus is cold. He's free, undisturbed, contented, comfortable, unperturbed. Or her mouth is cold, or he's able to create peace always. So there are lots of examples of this. And even in reflex, it's not much, but you find examples, froid calme, froid tranquille, se calmer, things like that. And also paisible, timide, paix, silencieux, these kinds of associations. Now, wrapping up, many languages, but not all, use temperature words for talking about other phenomena. They can use them in extended senses, but not all. And the absence of such uses in a language does not mean that there's a general aversion against metaphors. So in those quotes that I had, Alex says this, and on the languages of Vanuatu, Fernando says about Mapudungun, people say things about the Australian languages. They may fetch their metaphors from other domains. So I think that your example, Alex, was it sharp?
For spice?
No, you're sharp that can be used in many different figurative... Heavy. Yeah, so it can be sharp, it can be heavy, so it can be some kind of sensation, but not necessarily temperature. What this in turn depends on, I don't know, there might be various factors. Then affectionate, warm expressions turn out to be relatively restricted among the languages of the world, whereas hot use for intensity, including anger, passion, aggression, danger, is found much more frequently. And there may be a good reason for that. So when people working on affections and emotions and all that, they have different parameters for analyzing these things. And one of the dimensions is valency. So whether an emotion or a state is pleasant or unpleasant. And the other is arousal, how intensive it is, how much agitated you are. So when it comes to warmth as affection, it's primarily this valency. So something is nice, and some temperatures are nice, and you associated them with nice emotions or white predispositions. And this is, of course, much more subjective than the arousal, which is basically the same reaction in your body independently of your other things. So it may be one of the reasons for why affectionate, warm expressions are much more culturally biased, or whatever it can be, than hot used for intensity, anger, passion, and all this, because they have this very different orientation to start with. And I also wanted to say a few words. I have many slides left that are not systematized. because I wanted to say a few words about the enterprise itself of unveiling and collecting systematic data on the extended use of temperature terms. It's a very challenging enterprise. It's a very methodological, it's a big methodological challenge. So one thing is that, as I mentioned, even if we start with the conceptual metaphor theory, things become unsurmountable, because then you have to just dig through the whole language to find some examples of any collections, any associations. But this is one thing. The other is, so even if we leave this apart, the other thing is that these uses are very often dependent on particular entities and particular constructions. And also these uses are very often these metaphorical extended uses. It's very difficult to set a label on them. So if you look in dictionaries in what I presented, something is, he's a generous, kind, friendly, affectionate. You know that it's something very positive, but you really can't point to it. So I even asked, what's a warm person? How, I asked my Swedish colleagues and my friends and my family, who is a warm person? And then they can't really define it, but they will give you a few typical characteristics. So this is not the information, and that makes it, for instance, very difficult when you go to these lexical databases that I talked about. I checked collexifications for clicks, for warm and hot, nothing, basically. So these warm people, warm smiles, that's out. That they don't have anything like that. The only thing that you get for hot will be fire or things like that. For cold, it's slightly different, but then what you get is wet, you get disease, you get air, or these kinds of things, but nothing about these emotional things. And even reflex, which is much better in many respects, you get very occasional things. For I've just checked for sure, or hot, you hardly get any angry. I think there was one hit, even though it is present in many African languages, because it's not exactly what you find in the dictionaries. So this is one thing. The other is, as I said, it's very dependent on the entity. So again, coming back to this never-ending enterprise, so if you have these extended uses of hot, what you get is very dependent on the body part you're talking about. So in some languages it's ears, in other languages it will be head, it will be body, it will be mouth, and depending on what you talk about, it can be different meanings. So in Llacan, no, it was cold, or was it Eve? One of those. So if you talk about a cold mouth, okay, he's a polite person, he's a diplomatic person. If it's a cold ear, then, well, nothing dangerous has happened. If it's anus, I'm generally at ease, So this is, again, this makes it very, very complicated. So one and the same word will give different uses. Not only that, you also have different constructions. So this is something I'm struggling with right now for the Ghanaian languages. You will have different constructions. So sometimes it's a person who does something. Sometimes it's the body part, which is of something, and then it can be he has a body part of something. So it's very, very complicated. But I don't think we should give up. I think it's very interesting. So I hope that there will be more work done, systematic work on different languages and on different potentially interesting domains for discussing these extended uses of whatever it can be. I can speak more, but I can also finish.